The Holloway estate stood alone on the moors, where fog crawled like breath over graves and the wind carried voices no one wished to name. Its windows were eyes, watching, remembering, never blinking. Inside, the corridors whispered with the weight of a bloodline that had folded in on itself too many times to remain sane. Eliza Holloway had outlived husbands, sons, and daughters, but the house obeyed her as though she were stitched into its very walls. Her presence lingered in every mirror, every shadow, every quiet breath. Servants spoke of her gentleness in the daylight, how she moved like a widow in prayer, yet at night they heard her pacing, barefoot, murmuring old hymns in a tongue no one had ever learned. No one dared question how her garden bloomed even in winter, or why the nursery at the end of the West Hall had been locked since before any of them were born. No one dared to ask why the family portraits stopped being painted after the year 1912, the same year her youngest daughter died, and the same year the records began to blur. When the news spread that the matriarch was with child again, the villagers crossed themselves and refused to speak her name. For how could a woman of her years carry new life? And whose blood, they whispered, could possibly run in that unborn child's veins? The answer, as with all things in Holloway Manor, was something the earth itself had tried to bury. The Holloway estate loomed across the moors like a wounded creature refusing to die. Time had weathered its bones, but it still stood, vast, cold, and unyielding, its many chimneys jutting into the grey sky like blackened fingers. No one remembered when it was first built, only that it had always been there, its walls shifting subtly with each generation, as if the house itself grew alongside the family that inhabited it. The villagers kept their distance. They said the air around the estate was wrong, too still, too heavy, carrying the faint scent of something rotting beneath the soil. Even birds avoided its roof, they flew wide arcs around it, as though some instinct warned them away. Eliza Holloway, the matriarch, had lived within those walls her entire life. To her, the isolation was not a curse but a form of worship. She believed the outside world diluted people, made them forget who they were, where they came from. The estate was her sanctuary, a temple of remembrance, where the Holloway blood could remain unsullied by the noise of others. Her children had been born there, her grandchildren too, each generation delivered in the same candlelit room where portraits of their ancestors hung like silent witnesses. The manor's corridors were long and narrow, their walls lined with mirrors that distorted more than they reflected. Footsteps echoed oddly, sometimes a half-second too late, as though the house walked with you, a step behind. The servants, few as they were, spoke little, their eyes perpetually lowered. They had learned quickly that questions here were dangerous things, and curiosity was the fastest path to dismissal or worse, vanishing altogether. In the evenings, when the sun dipped beneath the moor, the estate transformed. Shadows lengthened into strange shapes, and the wind slipped through the broken shingles, humming notes that almost formed words. Eliza often sat by the tall windows then, her figure wrapped in lace, her face unreadable in the flicker of the firelight. She would watch the horizon as if expecting someone, her lips moving faintly, whispering the same prayer she had spoken since her youth, one no one else had ever heard clearly enough to repeat. The few who had visited described an unease that lingered long after they left, a feeling of having stepped into something ancient, something that watched and measured every movement. The estate was more than a home, it was a presence, vast, patient, and alive, and every Holloway who lived within it carried the same quiet hunger in their eyes. The disappearance of Samuel Holloway began, as most tragedies in that house did, in silence. He was the youngest of Eliza's grandsons, a pale, thoughtful boy of 17 with a peculiar stillness about him, a gentleness that set him apart from his cousins. He had been seen last wandering the eastern orchard at dusk, the same orchard where the apple trees grew twisted and black-veined, their fruit tasting faintly of iron. By morning, his bed was empty, the sheets still warm, and his boots left at the foot of the door as though he'd meant to return. No one spoke of it aloud at first, the family had learned to interpret absence as inevitability. People came and went in Holloway Manor, but some simply stopped existing within its halls. Eliza did not allow panic. She gathered the household in the grand dining room, her eyes calm and commanding, her voice soft yet absolute. She told them Samuel had gone to the city for study, that he would write once he was settled. No one believed her, not really, but none dared challenge her word. The servants exchanged uneasy glances, They had seen her the night before, standing in the orchard long after midnight, her white nightdress clinging to her body in the damp air, her hands buried in the soil as if planting something too precious for the daylight. Days passed, then weeks. The air in the manor grew heavier, carrying a faint sweetness, like wilted flowers left too long in a vase. Samuel's room was locked, and Eliza forbade anyone from speaking his name. She ordered his portrait removed from the gallery, instructing the staff to burn it, though they later whispered that she had taken the ashes and mixed them with her tea. Stranger things began to occur. A maid claimed she heard footsteps in the corridor outside Samuel's room, bare, dragging, as if someone were learning to walk again. Another swore she'd seen the boy's reflection in one of the hall mirrors, his face hollowed, his mouth open as though screaming. Yet whenever Eliza passed, the manor fell into a reverent quiet, and no one dared look at her directly. It was during one of her nightly vigils in the east wing that she was heard humming softly to herself, the same lullaby she used to sing to Samuel as a child. The sound drifted through the halls, faint but haunting, and when it faded, the house seemed to exhale. From that night on, no one spoke his name again, as though silence itself had swallowed him whole. It was late one afternoon when Clara, the youngest maid, found herself wandering beyond the boundaries of where servants were permitted. She had been in the Holloway house for only 3 months, long enough to learn that curiosity was dangerous but not long enough to silence the instinct completely. The West Hall had always unsettled her. It was colder there, quieter, and the air seemed to resist every breath. Yet something drew her toward the end of that long corridor, where a heavy wooden door stood cloaked in dust and spider silk, its brass knob darkened with age. It was a door no one mentioned, one that didn't appear on any of the household's maps. The corridor itself seemed to grow narrower as she approached. The portraits on the walls, faded images of Holloway ancestors, appeared to follow her with disapproving eyes. The silence was so complete that her own heartbeat seemed like an intrusion. She hesitated at the door, running her fingers over the deep scratches etched into the wood. Someone had tried to force it open once, long ago. The keyhole was stuffed with wax, sealing it like a wound. Clara hesitated only a moment longer before sliding the end of her broom handle against the latch. With a sharp crack, the wax broke, and the door groaned open. The smell that escaped was thick and cloying, a mix of dust, old linen, and something faintly metallic. The light from her candle shuddered as if unwilling to enter. Inside was a small nursery, perfectly preserved yet long dead. The walls were painted with childish patterns of moons and stars, though the colors had bled into something gray and sickly. A cradle stood in the center of the room, its blanket still folded neatly, a single child's rattle resting beside it. On the far wall, a row of portraits lined the shelves, each depicting a child with the same pale hair, the same strange hollow eyes, all wearing the same locket around their neck. Clara's breath caught when she noticed one of the portraits had been defaced. Deep scratches ran across the child's face, and beneath it, in faded ink, was a date that matched the year Eliza's youngest daughter had died. On a small table lay a book, its leather cracked and stiff, its pages filled with handwriting so spidery it was almost illegible. The last entry ended abruptly, mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. She barely heard the whisper behind her, a breath more than a sound, before the candle flickered out, plunging her into darkness. For a moment she thought she heard the soft creak of the cradle rocking on its own, slow and deliberate, as if something unseen had been waiting for her return. The discovery of the Holloway journal began with an accident. After the night in the nursery, Clara could not shake what she had seen or thought she had seen, and her trembling hands betrayed her the next morning as she dusted the library shelves. A row of ancient books toppled from the topmost ledge, scattering a century of dust, and among them fell a small, leather-bound volume darker than the rest, its spine unmarked, its cover tied shut with faded ribbon. When she untied it, the air in the room shifted, the temperature dipping enough to make her breath visible. The first page bore only a name *H, 1841 *, and beneath it, a single phrase written in a child's hand, *, the blood remembers. The entries that followed were fragmented at first, almost tender in tone, the early recollections of a woman devoted to her family's lineage. She wrote of purity, of tradition, of keeping the Holloway blood unbroken through the generations. But as the years passed within the pages, the tone darkened, the handwriting tightening into something desperate. There were mentions of dreams that spoke through walls, of voices belonging to the dead instructing her on how to preserve their strength, and of ceremonies performed on nights when the moon hung lowest, its light red and swollen. She described how the Holloway bloodline had been ordained, that mingling with outsiders diluted a sacred power that had been carried since the family's founding. One passage told of a night when the ancestors awoke, when they gathered unseen in the mirrors that lined the halls, whispering to her great-grandmother of the old ways. It was they, she wrote, who taught the family the ritual of binding a union of chosen blood meant to keep the lineage eternal. Every generation, one child was to be born through this act of reclamation, a vessel to carry the first blood forward. Clara read with mounting horror, realizing that the language, though archaic, seemed to describe something more than symbolic. There were details too precise, references to names she recognized, Eliza's own parents among them. When Clara turned to the final entry, the ink had been smeared by what looked like tears. The words were short, frantic, *, the child will come through her. The line must not falter. I will keep the blood pure, even if it costs heaven itself. Clara slammed the book shut, her heart racing, for she suddenly understood that this was no family legend or forgotten superstition. The journal was a confession, written by generations who had mistaken madness for inheritance, and devotion for damnation. When word spread that Eliza Holloway was with child, the manor seemed to hold its breath. The servants whispered in corners, their voices trembling between disbelief and fear, but none dared let the rumor reach her ears. She was 74, her hair silver as frost, her skin translucent as wax, and yet her belly had begun to swell beneath her mourning gowns. She carried herself as though nothing were amiss, continuing her routines with eerie calm, her morning walks through the garden, her afternoon tea by the window, her nightly visits to the chapel where no one else was permitted to enter. The villagers who glimpsed her from afar swore she glowed faintly under the moonlight, as if the child she bore cast its own pallid light from within. Doctors were summoned and turned away. Eliza claimed no illness, no need for examination, dismissing their concern with a soft, commanding smile. The Holloway blood knows its own, she told them, and the way she said it left no room for argument. Within the manor, the atmosphere shifted. Doors began to creak open on their own, and the scent of lilies, her favorite flower, though none had bloomed in months, lingered in every hallway. Late at night, the staff reported hearing a second heartbeat in the stillness, soft but distinct, echoing through the walls as though the house itself was carrying it. Clara watched the changes unfold with dread. She noticed how Eliza's reflection seemed to move a fraction slower than her body, how the old woman sometimes paused mid-step, pressing a hand to her stomach as if listening to someone speak from within. There were nights when light glowed faintly beneath her chamber door, pulsing rhythmically, and a low humming drifted into the corridor, a lullaby without words. The servants avoided that part of the house altogether after one of them, a kitchen boy, claimed to have seen a small hand press against the inside of Eliza's abdomen, the shape visible through the fabric of her gown before disappearing again. The family, what remained of it, withdrew into themselves. No one dared confront her. They dined in uneasy silence while she presided at the head of the table, serene, her thin fingers resting over her stomach as if guarding something sacred. When one of her nieces finally gathered the courage to ask who the father was, Eliza's smile never faltered. The blood, she said quietly, her eyes gleaming in the candlelight, has found its way home. The words silenced the room, for everyone understood, in some unspoken and dreadful way, that the answer had nothing to do with any mortal man. The confession came on a night when the air itself seemed to tremble. The storm had gathered without warning, black clouds folding over the manor like a shroud, thunder crawling across the sky in slow, rolling waves. Most of the household had taken shelter in the servants' quarters, whispering prayers they could barely remember. Only Clara remained awake, drawn by the faint sound of sobbing that echoed through the corridor. It came from the chapel, the one room Eliza had forbidden anyone to enter after sunset. The door was ajar, and through the narrow opening she saw candlelight flickering wildly against the stone walls. Inside, one of the grandsons, Thomas, pale and fevered, knelt before the altar. His face was streaked with tears, his hands trembling so violently that the rosary beads slipped between his fingers. Clara hesitated, ready to flee, but his voice broke the silence in a hoarse whisper that rooted her in place. She said it was a blessing, he murmured. She said it was what the blood demanded. His words came in fragments, disjointed, as though part of him could not bear to remember. He spoke of how Eliza had called him to her chamber weeks before the rumors began, how she had sat him beside her and told him the family's survival depended on him. He said she spoke of the ancestors, their faces shimmering in the mirrors, urging her to continue the sacred line. She told him that he was chosen, that his veins carried the strength of their founding blood, and that through him the Holloways would be reborn. Thomas's voice cracked as he confessed that he had tried to refuse, that he had begged her to stop, but she had wept and clung to him, whispering that he was her salvation, that they were both servants to something far older than shame. He said she wore a white gown that night, the same one she had been married in half a century ago, and that when the candlelight touched her eyes, they glowed with something neither human nor divine. Clara's breath hitched, her heart pounding as Thomas turned toward her. His expression was hollow, his skin almost translucent, his lips trembling as if the words themselves were burning him from within. "It wasn't sin," he said, voice barely audible over the thunder. She said it was resurrection. Then his eyes darted to the darkened corner of the chapel, where a shadow seemed to shift on its own, and his body went rigid. Clara followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, only the faint scent of lilies and the echo of a soft, satisfied sigh that seemed to come from everywhere at once. By the time the priest arrived, the Holloway estate had already begun to decay from within. The walls wept moisture, the air carried the sour scent of lilies long past bloom, and every clock in the house had stopped on a different hour. Father Alden came at the village's insistence, a man of strict discipline, grey-haired and lean, known for his stern sermons against superstition. He rode through the moor at dusk, the fog swallowing the path behind him, and when he saw the manor rise from the haze, even his faith wavered. Its windows glowed faintly, not with candlelight, but with something dim and pulsating, as if the building itself drew breath. Eliza greeted him at the door with her usual poise, dressed in black lace despite the heat. Her smile was polite, her tone gentle, but her eyes, sharp, unblinking, unsettled him. She offered tea and spoke of the family's health, of the quiet countryside, of her longing for peace. When he mentioned the rumors, her smile tightened but did not fade. "People love stories," she said, pouring the tea with a steady hand. "And fear makes the best ones." Yet when she leaned forward, her hand brushed against his, and her skin was cold, not the chill of age, but the temperature of stone. Father Alden insisted on seeing the chapel, claiming it his duty to cleanse the house of gossip and sin. Eliza allowed it, though her voice lost its warmth. "Be careful," she murmured as she handed him a small brass key. "Faith can open doors best left closed." He entered the chapel just before midnight. The air inside was thick with incense and something faintly coppery. Candles lined the altar, burning low, their flames unnaturally still. On the floor before the crucifix lay symbols drawn in what looked like darkened wax, forming a circle that pulsed faintly as if alive. He began to pray, his voice trembling, but the sound seemed swallowed by the stone. A soft sound broke through his prayer, a whisper, rising and falling like breath. It came from the shadows behind the altar, where the flickering light hinted at movement. Then he heard it clearly, a woman's voice, singing a lullaby in a language he did not know. The melody was both tender and mournful, and as it swelled, the candles began to bend toward it, their flames leaning as though drawn by wind. The priest's crucifix slipped from his grasp, the metal burning hot against his skin. His scream was heard only once before the manor fell silent again, and when morning came, the chapel door stood open, the brass key resting on the threshold, wet with blood that had not yet cooled. The night Eliza Holloway went into labor, the sky broke open. Thunder rolled endlessly over the moors, and the wind howled through the chimneys like the cries of lost children. The manor's candles guttered out one by one, though no draught could explain it, and every mirror fogged from within as though exhaling. The servants gathered in the hall, clutching each other, too terrified to move, for from the upper floors came sounds that no human throat should have been able to make. They heard chanting at first, low and rhythmic, a voice both commanding and pleading, followed by a chorus of whispers that seemed to echo the same words seconds later. Then came the screams, not sharp, not fleeting, but drawn out, filled with something that was neither pain nor life. Clara, unable to resist, crept up the grand staircase, candle in hand. The closer she came to Eliza's chamber, the thicker the air became, heavy with the stench of iron and something sweetly decayed. The door stood half open, its hinges creaking with each crash of thunder. Inside, the light from a dozen candles cast grotesque shadows that writhed across the walls. Eliza lay on the bed, her body frail yet trembling with unnatural strength, her hair unbound, her skin gleaming with sweat. Around her stood the remaining Holloway relatives, silent, their faces pale and expressionless, their hands clasped together as if in prayer. The air pulsed with the rhythm of Eliza's breathing, and beneath it, impossibly, another breath answered in unison. The storm outside reached its peak, lightning flaring white across the ceiling, and the house shuddered as if alive. Eliza's eyes rolled back, and from her mouth poured a sound that froze Clara where she stood, a sound like two voices layered atop each other, one ancient, one newborn. The family's chant rose to match it, the syllables sharp and foreign, vibrating through the walls until even the paintings trembled on their hooks. When the final scream tore through the night, every candle in the manor went out, plunging the house into complete blackness. What followed was silence. Then, from the bed, a cry rose, soft, thin, but unmistakably human. Relief might have followed, had it not been for the second sound that came immediately after, a deeper, rasping wail, too low, too knowing. The servants below fell to their knees as the wind tore through the manor, extinguishing every trace of warmth. When dawn finally came, the storm had passed, but the air still hummed faintly, and those who entered the room found only Eliza, pale and still, her arms wrapped around a cradle that rocked on its own, though no breath stirred within it. The fire began without warning, though some said it had been waiting for years. It was a moonless night, the kind where the world itself seemed to hold its breath. The manor, exhausted from generations of whispered sins, groaned under its own weight as if ready to surrender. The first spark was seen by the groundskeeper, a faint, flickering light in the west wing, where the nursery had long been sealed. Within moments, the windows glowed a sickly orange, and smoke coiled upward, swallowing the chimneys that had so long pierced the sky. By the time the villagers saw the blaze from the valley, the entire Holloway estate was burning like a beacon to something far older than fire. Inside, chaos unfolded with dreamlike slowness. The corridors filled with smoke, thick and black, carrying with it the scent of lilies and burnt wax. Servants fled, coughing and screaming, but the family did not follow. Those who escaped swore they saw Eliza's kin standing calmly in the drawing room, their faces lit gold by the flames, unmoving, as though waiting for something sacred. Above them, the roof cracked open, and the sound that followed was not the roar of fire but a single, echoing cry, that same strange dual voice that had haunted the manor since the night of the birth. Clara, half blind from the smoke, stumbled through the halls in search of the cradle. She had heard it, faint and rhythmic, the creak of wood rocking amid the destruction. Each step was agony, heat blistering her skin, ash falling like black snow, but she could not stop. When she reached the nursery, the door was already gone, swallowed by flame, and inside the room, everything glowed as if lit from within. The cradle stood untouched in the center, rocking gently. Around it, the floorboards burned in a perfect circle, the flames refusing to cross. She saw Eliza then, or what was left of her, not consumed, but luminous, her outline shimmering like light through glass. Her eyes found Clara's for an instant, calm and knowing, before the fire surged upward, swallowing her whole. The roof collapsed before anyone could reach her. The manor burned through the night, its timbers screaming, its foundations cracking. When the first light of dawn broke through the smoke, all that remained were fragments of stone and a strange quiet that clung to the air. In the ashes of the west wing, they found only one thing left intact, a cradle, blackened but unburned, its wood cold to the touch. It rocked softly on the breeze, creaking as if soothed by invisible hands, and within it lay nothing but a small silver locket, warm as living flesh. Decades passed before anyone spoke the Holloway name again. The estate, now little more than charred stone and creeping ivy, had become a ruin the locals avoided. Children dared each other to step beyond the gates, but none lasted long. The air was too still, the silence too thick, and sometimes, they said, the sound of a rocking cradle could be heard beneath the wind. The Holloway lineage was believed extinct, its records lost to flame. Only the churchyard bore their name now, carved into eroded stones that leaned toward the earth as if trying to hide themselves. Yet history, like blood, has a way of resurfacing when least desired. It began with a young historian named Marianne. She had been researching family migrations in the region, tracing old parish ledgers, when she found a single entry that defied sense. Eliza Holloway, mother and child, recorded 40 years apart, both with the same birthmark. The ink had faded, but the words carried weight, unsettling in their precision. Intrigued, she began to reconstruct the Holloway family tree, combing through forgotten archives, private letters, and what remained of the estate's papers salvaged after the fire. Each discovery deepened her unease. Names repeated in impossible sequences. Generations looped where they should have branched. One child's signature matched that of a grandparent born a century earlier. The bloodline folded inward, like a serpent devouring its own tail. As Marianne delved further, she began to feel watched. Shadows lingered at the edge of lamplight when she worked late into the night, and more than once, she woke to find her notes rearranged, the same phrase scrawled across the margins in a hand not her own. The blood remembers. Her dreams grew feverish. Visions of a house on fire, a woman in black cradling something unseen, the sound of two voices crying in unison. She told herself it was fatigue, the product of too many sleepless nights surrounded by old dust and darker history. But the unease grew harder to ignore when she uncovered one final document, a birth certificate, unsigned, dated only a decade before. The name listed for the mother was Eliza Holloway. The address field was left blank, and under father, a single word had been written in trembling ink *same. Marianne stared at the page for a long time, the air around her turning cold. As she traced the looping signature at the bottom, her hands began to shake. It was her own name written there, clear and elegant, in a script she had never learned.